Hello and welcome to our latest live panel discussion as part of our virtual Sustainable Packaging Summit. My name is Elisabeth Skoda and I'm the editor-at-large at Packaging Europe. So we're all aware that challenging the mindsets of linear production processes and consumption models and moving away from a throwaway mentality is key to developing a truly circular economy. And reusable packaging is an essential piece of that puzzle. So in today's panel, we'll discuss recent developments and opportunities in the reusable packaging space, possibilities as well as limitations, and also ways to overcome roadblocks to scaling up reusable packaging schemes. And of course, as always, we have a bit of time at the end of the session for audience questions. So feel free to pop them into the comments on LinkedIn, and I'll read as many of them out to our panelists when I get the chance. So I'm very pleased to welcome our panel today and who've taken the time out of their busy schedule to be here with us today. So we have Alex Grabowski, who is Director of Plastics and Materials Science at WWF. We also have Mike Newman, who is CEO at Returnity. Furthermore, Joanne Chidley, who is the co-founder of Beauty Kitchen and Riri. And last but not least, we have Rosie Sharp, who is Creative Partner Plastics and Packaging at Hubbub. So yeah, welcome everybody. And thanks very much for being on the panel today. So to start us off, would you be able to very briefly introduce yourselves and tell us a bit more about your work and your company and how your work relates to reusable packaging? Maybe starting with you, Alex.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Grabowski. I'm Director of Plastic Material Science here at WWF. And reusable packaging most directly relates to WWF's work through our goal of no plastic in nature by 2030, where we're looking to turn off the tap of plastic flowing into nature and to do it without trading one crisis for another, which means finding solutions that don't result in climate trade-offs, don't drive more deforestation, and don't cause more food waste, among other things. And we think that reusable systems are a real key lever for achieving this vision. So that's why we're working to advance the uptake of reusable business models to make our material system more circular and, just as important, smaller. So we extend the life of the natural resources we use. And we think that to be successful, these systems need to be environmentally sound, economically sustainable, and socially inclusive. So that's what we're working towards.
Great. Yeah, looking forward to hearing a bit more about that also during the rest of the panel. So yeah, Mike, would you like to go next, maybe?
Yes, hello. I'm Mike Newman. I'm CEO of Returnity, calling in today from Brooklyn, New York, where we're based. Returnity focuses on reusable shipping and delivery packaging systems. And we work with clients all over the world, from Walmart to Estee Lauder, New Balance, et cetera. And our key really is thinking about systems, not product, as a driver for reuse. We like to say that reusables will only be adopted if they are unit economic competitive, if they make sense for brands from an operational, economic, and environmental standpoint. So our work is really centered around how systems can work for reuse, and then what's the right packaging for that job. And the integration of those things is what we think is really key. So this panel is great. We're really excited to kind of dig in on some of those issues and appreciate this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Mike. Rosie, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself next.
Sure. Hello, my name's Rosie Sharp, and I'm a creative partner in plastics and packaging at Hubbub. Hubbub are an environmental charity based in London, and we focus on encouraging citizen behaviour change in a way that is positive, creative, and fun. So sort of engaging people on sustainability topics, but in a way that doesn't make them feel bad, doesn't scare them or put them off. Our projects are a wide range of topics, from things like home energy efficiency, sustainable fashion, reducing food waste and sustainable diets. My focus is plastics and packaging. So that includes mainly waste and resources projects, from litter and recycling to compostables, reuse and waste reduction. And most recently, I have led a project which has resulted in a report called Reuse Systems Unpacked. This report shares the experiences from over 40 organisations in the reusable food and drink packaging space in the UK, and it's intended to encourage new systems to set up and other systems to scale by sharing the challenges and barriers that they've experienced.
Great, thank you, Rosie. And last but not least, Jo, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Hi, everyone. Well, so for me, this panel is just a starting point for many different topics. But in our part of reuse, the FMCG industry, as in fast-moving consumer goods, creates over 161 million tonnes of plastic packaging every year. And sadly, we know that most of this isn't recycled. The global packaging industry is worth $1 trillion annually. 99% is single-use, and less than 1% of the reusable packaging is smart and trackable. Re is a borrow anywhere, return anywhere, and reuse anywhere alternative to single-use packaging. It's a scalable whole system approach for refill and return on the go. It's using smart reusable packaging, and it removes the barriers for retailers, brands, and consumers who want to participate in the circular economy. So, hi everybody, I'm Jo Chidley. I'm a chemist and founder of Beauty Kitchen and the Re packaging system. And I'm based here in Glasgow in Scotland, but I'm sure my accent gave that away. Just on the ethical side, Beauty Kitchen is one of the highest ranked B corporations in the world, and all of our products are cradle to cradle certified, which is highly unusual within the personal care and beauty industry. But the reason why I wanted to target that particular industry is that everyone on the planet uses personal care products at some point in their lifetime, and generally on a regular basis. And that was where we then formed the reusable packaging system, because it's something that we know can get people into the habit of reusing. And when it comes to personal care, we should be reusing the packaging anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. That's I'm looking forward to hearing more about this as well during the discussion. While I'm talking to you, I wanted to dig a bit deeper there, and I understand that Riri has worked on reusable packaging trails with major brands and retailers such as Asda and Unilever. And I was wondering, could you tell me a bit more about the challenges you encountered in these collaborations and any learnings from this?
Well, the challenge is that they're always pilots on a small scale. And when you're a small startup business, really, whether it's one store or 50 stores, the amount of work that you need to do for that is the same. There's not that much of a difference. So that's one of the major challenges. One of the other challenges is around the aspect that brands and retailers have got this fixation that packaging is part of the brand's identity. And we understand that, alongside another list of barriers from the LCAs for single-use plastic are lower emissions than reusables. How do you get the returns back to either store or point of purchase? How do you clean the returns? How do you understand the cleaning protocols that go in with cleaning that packaging? For me, a lot of these are excuses. They're things to be overcome. But that's where we've utilised our own indie brand, because we've had to overcome all of those barriers to entry, if you like, into reuse, so that we can go back with real strong data with these large brands and retailers to give them the reassurance. So, you know, for me, and somebody's already touched on it, in terms of scale, and that was why I started with those 1 or 2 line pitches in terms of the size of the opportunity, but there's something that just seems to be blocking these much larger retailers and brands from taking that much larger approach to reusable packaging in particular, rather than just running pilots. And it's not just pilots that they run with our organisation. You know, if I take Unilever, for instance, they've got somewhere in the region to 20 or 30 different pilots that are being run across the globe in different formats, and with different organisations. And I just wonder, you know, if that pilot will ever get to scale. The good news is that here we've been focused very much in the UK, and we recently launched with Marks and Spencer's, where we did all of their home care SKUs, and that's about 14 different products, I think. And that's gone into, it's only 2 stores, so it's starting off at 2 and it will increase to 9 over the next couple of months. But the actual data that has come from those 2 stores have astounded both Marks and Spencer's. And although I maybe say they've astounded us, they haven't, because we kind of knew those results were going to come through the results that we've had with Beauty Kitchen. So I think that maybe gives you an overview of some of the challenges we face.
Yes, thank you, Jo. We'll obviously dig deeper into like the scaling up and the challenges of scaling up later in the discussion as well. And yeah, on that subject, Alex, I wanted to ask you, could you tell me a bit more about the work that WWF does when it comes to scaling up reuse systems, and what successes have you already seen in that area?
Yeah, thanks so much. Happy to. So we're engaged in several key initiatives to increase the uptake of reusable systems. Overall, we really see WWF's role is to act as a convener and to drive forward both awareness of reusables as a solution, as well as really tackle those hard questions that we still have to answer about it, so that we can really push forward those enabling conditions, right? And then allow others, like my amazing fellow panelists here, to implement. So some key initiatives that we're engaged in is Consumers Beyond Waste, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative convened by the World Economic Forum, where we really collaborated to publish reuse guidelines, which establish the guardrails for success and create this kind of common framework for everyone looking to implement these systems, as well as the Reuse Portal, which is a one-stop shop collaboration platform that aims to scale reuse solutions and address plastic pollution. So it had a soft launch in May, the Reuse Portal did, and there's actually more functionality coming this fall, but it's really set up to help people learn from each other from these pilots. And one of the barriers we see is that oftentimes pilots can be small and it can be really hard to share learnings. So that's what this one piece of what this platform is looking to address. And then currently in process, if I could mention one more thing, we're also collaborating on a common measurement method for reusable packaging, which we think is going to be really important for companies that are looking to shift their portfolios from single use. So some key questions around this are, how does a global company actually quantify how much of their portfolio is offered in reusable packaging, right? This is something that's not such an easy question to answer, especially for some models like Refill at Home, where information on what's really happening can be really difficult to get and to understand. So we think that ultimately, to be able to show impact, we all need to be measuring the same way so that we can compare results. And so we're really excited about this work and look forward to sharing more about it when it's finished.
Yes, we definitely also look forward to hearing more about these results. So yeah, I wanted to get back to you, Mike. Obviously, Returnity works in the secondary packaging space and has collaborated with major companies such as Walmart. And I was wondering, what are the specific challenges in the secondary packaging space for reusable packaging, and also the opportunities, as it seems there's maybe a bit more reusable packaging already in that area?
Well, I mean, I think the market impact is sort of undeniable, and the growth from e-commerce and the pandemic and everything. In the U.S. alone, it's enough cardboard every year to pave a cardboard road a mile wide from New York to LA and back 3 times. So it's like an insane amount of packaging, and there's no question that governments and retailers and consumers all are sort of seeing it. It's very visual. It's very in your face. We all know it's something that is a challenge and problematic. I think for us, we've been at it for 5 years now and really been beaten and battered by a lot of the things that have been so difficult for us as a global society, the pandemic and other trends, and sort of use that time and those struggles as a startup to really try and understand, well, where is scale in this marketplace. We were a product company when we first launched. We had this really cool reusable shipping bag, and we thought it was cool, but nobody wanted to use it. And we had to really confront ourselves and ask why. And by asking that difficult question of like, well, why is it hard to sell in this reusable bag? It works. It protects the contents. It goes from A to B and back to A again. It's really awesome. But people don't seem to want to really scale up its use. That exploration and that introspection is what has led us to where we are as a company today, and why we're doing millions of shipments and deliveries and reusables a month now, which is that product designers are generally who leads reusable packaging initiatives, and product designers are not the right people to lead these initiatives, because it's not a product problem, it's a systems problem. And if you don't bring a systems mentality to the table first, you get caught in these problems, which are often like the issue of I'm passionate about this, my coworkers are passionate about it, and even the people in the companies who we're talking to about switching to reusables are passionate about it. So it's going to work because we all love it, and isn't it cool? But you can get blinded to these underlying systemic challenges that exist. So, to us, that really is, do you get it back often enough, and do you get it back cheap enough? And you have to start there. If you don't start there and ask the right questions of, can I get enough uses out of this packaging in practice and not in theory? And can I keep it in circulation cheap enough in practice, not in theory? The programs won't scale. So there's a lot of programs that have started over the 5 years that we've been working on it. Very few that have scaled, because they tend to kind of sweep those problems under the rug a little bit. I think the industry is shifting now, and we'll keep talking about that. But that's our mentality: is we really have to be focused on systems and costs. That's how you have scale, and when you have scale, that's how you have impact. You have to go at it in that sequencing.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, that's a good point about creating the right systems, and we'll delve into that a bit more later in the session as well. Rosie, I wanted to ask you, obviously you mentioned at the beginning that you worked on a report that Hubbub recently released on reusable packaging. And I was wondering, could you talk us through some of the key findings in this report?
Sure. So just to set the scene, the report was being quite specific on what we were looking at. So it was reusable food and drink packaging. And we were looking at these systems where you borrow and return the packaging, rather than refill models or models where you take your own personal item of reusable packaging to be refilled. And we're also looking just in the UK. So to start off with, we did some public polling to find out what the people think in terms of what might encourage them to use a reusable packaging system and what might put them off. So a few key findings from that. A positive one: 73% of people thought that more needs to be done to make it easier to use reusable alternatives, so that we buy less single-use food and drink packaging. Some of the top motivators were being able to use a reusable packaging system for no extra cost, being able to earn rewards or discounts for using it, and knowing that it's better for the environment. And some of the biggest barriers were concerns that the packaging might not be clean or hygienic, concerns that it might cost more money, and also having to carry or store the packaging before being able to return it to the vendor. So that was sort of setting the scene of the public opinion. And then we went on to conduct interviews with 40 organisations in the UK. So these ranged from startups whose business model is centred purely around a reusable packaging system, large companies such as Tesco, who have been trialling reusable packaging, and then other key figures in policy or academia who have been working on this topic. So we conducted interviews with 40 organisations and were compiling the challenges and opportunities that they'd experienced, so that we could share that information for others to take on board, rather than experiencing the same challenges themselves. Some of the key themes that we identified from that: we identified 10 overall, but I'll just talk through 3 of the top themes that I think link together quite nicely. So the first one is that convenience is key, and for reuse systems to be able to become mainstream, we're going to have to minimize the friction points and make sure that reuse systems fit within the current behaviours and habits of the people using them. And one of the best ways that we can achieve this is through collaboration, which is one of our next key themes. So by collaborating, brands and retailers will be able to get reuse systems working at scale more than if they're doing this independently. As Joe was saying, at the moment there's lots of trials, everyone's dipping a toe, experiencing it for themselves, finding out what those challenges are. But from a consumer point of view, it's going to be too confusing and complex if each brand or retailer has their own system and you have multiple apps, you have deposits with various companies, there's different methods of how each system works, and that's going to be such huge barriers for reuse to scale. So we learned through our research that by encouraging collaboration between brands and retailers, that we have more systems working across more organizations, that customers can get a coffee cup from one retailer, deposit it to another, the same for supermarkets or takeaway food. So that's really going to help reduce confusion, and as well, it will help reduce costs for both customers and hopefully businesses as well. But one of the big issues around encouraging collaboration is branding. So the third theme that I wanted to talk about was the importance of packaging design and finding the right balance. There was one interesting point that we discovered through our research about the balance between desirability and if you're paying a deposit or paying more for reusable packaging, that some people want that to be a nice object and have a really nice user experience with that. Other organizations found that they want the packaging to be as standardized and almost ugly as possible so that people won't want to hang on to it and they'll be happy to give it back. And that will also help keep costs cheaper if the packaging is as standard as possible. But just touching on the issue of branding and collaboration, I think it's important for brands and retailers to focus on conveying their branding through the user experience, through the different touch points, whether it's online, within an app, in store, rather than focusing on just the logo on a piece of packaging. And that's one way that we can encourage more collaboration.
Thank you, Rosie. Yeah, some really interesting points there. And the whole topic of encouraging collaboration is really key, and obviously something we strive to do here with our panels and other content as well. So Rosie, you mentioned polling. This brings me to my next question. We conducted a quite really unscientific poll on LinkedIn at Packaging Europe to ask people what type of packaging they considered to be the most important piece of the puzzle when it comes to the circular economy. And out of the options, recyclable, reusable, compostable, and bio-based, we had about a bit over 2,000 people take part, and the results were recyclable packaging came out on top at 53%. Then we had the reusable packaging at 26%, compostable packaging 12%, and bio-based packaging 9%. But also in the comments said, obviously people said that it's important to have a mix and not just focus on one. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on what do you think about these results? Does that sort of chime in with your own personal experience in the packaging space?
So I can start if, yes, okay, great. I'm not surprised, I think, by these results, because I think they also are very much in line with what people are probably most familiar with and what they maybe have experienced, themselves, and also what is talked about a lot in articles, media, and things like that. But I do agree with those comments. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that it's not an either-or choice, right? We do need all of these solutions to be able to achieve our goals. And so instead of thinking about it as an either-or choice, we should instead be thinking about what should be prioritized and where, right? Based on the waste hierarchy, based on the application, and based on the region. And then really looking at, okay, how do we scale these different solutions in these different places in a way that's actually going to lead us ultimately to a system that works. And I just wanted to say that I think that this is a lot of how the plastic packs and various national stages are working at the national level, is to create that common kind of roadmap. And so just a plug that we think that, that is really something that is important to do, is to take that common vision forward.
I was going to go next, but you go, Rosie.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, similar to Alex, wasn't surprised by those results from the public polling that we conducted. Another stat was that 59% of people don't have an issue with single-use packaging if it can be recycled. So I think that reflects the public opinion, as well as perhaps the size of the recycling industry compared to the size of the reusable packaging industry. It is more mainstream, and there are more people who are working in that sector. I also think with things coming in like mandatory cup recycling is going to be introduced in the UK for coffee cups. There's also the rise of flexible plastic recycling, curbside trials, and supermarket takebacks. So I think perhaps the public opinion that recycling is sort of the best solution is perhaps only going to grow with those, if those more difficult to recycle items are becoming easier to recycle. However, I think there are definitely a lot of examples where reusable packaging is better for the environment, reduces carbon emissions, reduces resource use, which can be proved through life cycle analysis. So I think having reliable life cycle analysis will be important to be able to prove that. And the more that reuse becomes widespread, hopefully the more people will view it as a priority.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised by, the results. I think for me, it's always about value. And the challenge with single use is people just don't have any value attached to it. And although they may mean well to recycle, we know that the recycling infrastructure, just doesn't work. And something's got to change. And I think the other part is around this monoculture of plastic that we have created. And we know that in any circumstance, a monoculture is never great. Celebrating diversity and having different choices for different categories or different product types is the way to go. The challenge, as we know with reuse, is the infrastructure. And if we look at the World Economic Forum report around the future of reusables within consumables, that's what we've created, is that we are reuse providers, but we have collaborated with all aspects of the infrastructure, from the material suppliers to the packaging manufacturers, to the different sales channels in terms of brands, retailers and consumers, all the way through to the different washing facilities. And I think that's what it's around, the infrastructure and the systemic change that has to happen, that that we've all agreed on and Mike touched on. That takes longer, and it's just not as prevalent. Reuse is just not as prevalent. And the other thing is, we've kind of fallen out of love with it, because I am old enough to remember returning my soft drinks bottles, and it's something that we used to do. The difference and the exciting part for me now is that we have digital technology to be able to asset track, and every piece of packaging has a story. So the opportunity to change to a circular way of doing things than a linear way of doing things, I think is fascinating.
Yeah, I think when we work with clients, the thing I tell them is that reusable packaging, the mentality they need to have is that reusable packaging is worse for the planet and it's worse for their bottom line until it isn't. Like, you have to go into it with that understanding. This is a more expensive product, both economically and environmentally, until it gets enough use cycles. And that's how you have to think about this. So the challenge with, I think, a lot of this polling is that it reflects a lot of virtue signaling that we get from consumers and industry professionals alike, where they are aspiring to a certain behavior, but the in practice behavior is not matching that. And so when we say that reusables have to be used a lot to get an environmental benefit, it means a lot, like 85, 90% or more reuse rate. If you reuse it 75% of the time, which seems like amazing, and how often can we get 75% of consumers to do any pro-environmental action? Like, that should be celebrated, except in the case of reusable packaging, it only means 4 reuses for that package. And 4 reuses in almost any context of reuse is worse for the planet, given how much more durable and material intensive reusable packaging tends to be compared to single use. So it has to be 85, 90, 95% reuse rate. So asking people their sentiment I think is helpful from a macro trend analysis kind of standpoint of how is consumer and professional sentiment evolving. But the only numbers that really matter is how often do they actually take that action. And the quick story I would say is that before this, I worked for, at the time, the biggest mobile phone reuse company in the world at the time. And we had hundreds of employees coming in every day to sort and repair and redistribute these used mobile phones. And we had employees who would say, oh, I had that mobile phone at home that I meant to bring in. And the next day they come, I forgot that phone again. Like, that is so common. And we have to, instead of running from that reality of how consumers and humans act, we have to embrace it. So when I look at that polling, I think, well, that's kind of interesting. But what I'm more interested in is if we ask the next question, which is how many reusable products do you have that you use, and how often do you use them? Because absent that, the data doesn't really tell us that much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That brings me neatly to my next question, which was obviously that for any reusable packaging concept to work, high return rates are necessary. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how this can be sort of bolstered and achieved.
Sorry, was that to anyone in particular, Elizabeth? Sorry, did I miss that?
That was, yeah, just to anybody who feels, moved to answer the question.
So I'll go in here. Actually, we've been really surprised around the return rates. We did do analysis with the largest soft drinks company in Scotland, who had one of the oldest bottle washing facilities. It was 104 years old. Their deposit return scheme that they had is closed. It's sadly closed down now a few years ago. But what they had is a lot of data around how people returned things and what the return rates were. And that gave us a sense of reassurance in terms of what we were doing. And we also collaborate with other reuse providers. So Loop, for example, Algramo, Jean Boutet, based in France. And, the return rates were all averaging around the 80% return rate. Now, we obviously want that to be higher. The forecast that we have put in is 92%, because that 8% will be damages that, basically packaging that can't be reused. The challenge is that people want the convenience and the accessibility. I just want to return it anywhere. So it has to be part of their kind of a day in the life of Joe Chidley, picking up her morning coffee, going and buying her vitamins from wherever, getting laundry liquid somewhere else, and being able to drop all of those different reusables off. There's also a trial that's going to be running later this year in St Helens, which is near Liverpool in the UK, and that where the council are replacing the recycling boxes with reuse boxes, and everything is going to be returned from home. So it'll be really interesting to find out the data from that.
Does anybody else feel? Oops, sorry.
No, I would say, look, for us, I think our experience has been the instinct is to try and take the least circular packaging systems today, or the largest packaging systems, and switch them to reuse, because it'll have the biggest impact. And that's a natural instinct. I think what we found is that you have to be a lot more nuanced than that if you want it to scale up and to be successful, and that you have to find the most circular or the most controllable packaging systems. Those are the easiest to change. So if you take a long view, our view is take the things that you can build success off of today, and as consumer behavior, awareness, infrastructure, as these things evolve, the programs can evolve with them. But to try and take the least circular and least engaged relationships that companies have with packaging and their customers and switch them to reuse is usually where you see the least success. So that's our main takeaway: is solve the easy problems today, build towards the harder ones. When you start with the hardest ones, you lose steam. And look, Tesco just shut down their refill program. These are really hard problems to solve. And without that sort of nuanced application, you can really create barriers for the next round of pilots and success because you didn't use that nuance today.
Can I just maybe add, I definitely agree with everything that was said, that I think it's maybe inherently a little bit unfair to ask of this question of reuse when we're comparing it to something like recycling, which has, you know, government programs that are integrated into people's lives, right? Everywhere where recycling is successful, it is integrated into a community, right? And right now on reuse, except for maybe that one example that you shared about, you know, changing the boxes in the community, which is really interesting. Most of the time, it's up to the private sector, right, to get these things back. And it is a specialty program, and it is different than the norm, right? So of course, it's going to be more difficult, right, to get people to really work within that system than it is something that has been established and is very much, you know, integrated already into everyday life. So that's not to say that it's not important. It's very important. But just to say that, you know, this perspective we've gotten so far is really from the entrepreneur side, right? Because that's who a lot of these panelists are. But it should also be a question for policy and for governments, right? How can they actually support making this part of everyone's life?
Yeah, so just to add to Alex's point, for instance, in the UK, if you reuse, you still pay VAT, you still pay tax. And that just doesn't make sense, does it? It's like, so, you know, there's no level playing field from a commercial sense in terms of a single-use piece of packaging or a reuse piece of packaging.
Yes, thank you. Rosie, would you like to add anything to this point, or?
Sure, yeah, I was just going to add in terms of encouraging a high return rate and Joe's point about the St. Helens trial, which is super interesting. Those, if you can collect from home, I think that is one way to ensure a pretty high return rate. And in those environments, do you even need to pay a deposit? Do you even need additional incentives if it's so convenient that someone picks it up from your door? And I think with growing logistics and deliveries, like, you know, in a lot of urban areas in the UK, we are having, you can get your takeaway within half an hour, you can get your groceries delivered within 20 minutes. Even in rural areas, you can get your supermarket shop delivered to your door. And using those existing logistic networks to backhaul packaging, I think will be a great way to encourage high return rates and make the most of the logistics that are already out there.
Great, thank you. I also wanted to have a look at the effects of regulation on the packaging landscape and the reusable packaging landscape. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on regulations such as the EU Circular Economy Action Plan could have on, you know, maybe reuse being boosted, because obviously there's demands for a high percentage of packaging being used by companies to be either recyclable and reusable. So yeah, wanted to get your thoughts on that. Anybody like to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start off. I think it's helpful. I think Alex's point about asking the private sector to sort of carry this load alone isn't really fair. I think that there is maybe a little bit too much promise in how these different types of regulations and legislation are going to impact reuse across the planet. I mean, they don't necessarily solve the larger challenges of integrating consumer behavior, corporate action, and infrastructure as tightly as some might hope. You know, I think a key thing to sort of keep as a baseline is that there's a profound difference between bottle bills, where you're trying to take the packaging that's going to be used irregardless and increase the return rate to facilitate recycling, with a set of regulations that are necessitating a switch from one product type to another, where that new product type, as I said before, is more damaging for the planet unless it isn't. And that's what we're seeing here, like in the States, for example. In New Jersey, they put in place a ban on single-use delivery bags for grocery and restaurants. So they're all switching to reusable bags with no system for collecting up and reusing those bags. So they've made a thing that was made out of a very thin plastic. Now they're delivering them in a much thicker, more material intensive plastic that's not being reused. So today they're making the problem worse, not better. So I think that it's an important step. It's obviously pushing retailers to focus on innovation. It's making the issues more aware for consumers, but this is not going to be like a straight line towards nirvana. Like, there are some really profound challenges and differences in reuse than single use and recycling that aren't necessarily being captured quite yet. And are going to take time and a lot of smart efforts to really sort of get in front of the problem in the way I think the regulations are intended to do, but aren't maybe quite there yet.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit to that since I'm also here in the U.S. But I, definitely agree with Mike that kind of policy interventions are not always perfect, and sometimes they can lead to unintended consequences. So definitely, as with all things, the devil is in the detail, and making sure that policies that are put in place really do support a switch that makes sense and that has a system in place for collection, that kind of thing. But we do see policy change as a real lever that needs to happen. And specifically, I think we really need policies that help de-risk investment in reusable systems, because without that, I think it's going to be really hard to ever get to a real meaningful scale. And I also think that we need policies that support local governments and communities for them to be able to help drive reuse, because I think we don't necessarily want the future of how reuse looks to be 100% driven by the private sector only, right? We want to make sure that these systems serve people. And to the earlier point about collaboration, I think the best way to achieve a system that is collaborative and convenient for people is to have it be more community-based versus every single brand having their own system, right? So this is something that I think could really be supported, and something that I think we're going to need.
Just to add a bit about policy in the UK, I think there definitely needs to be incentives to prioritise reuse above recycling, and that definitely hasn't been the focus yet in UK policy, or subsidies or charges to close the gap between reusable and single-use packaging. And one area where I think there's a massive opportunity is we're planning to introduce the deposit return scheme in the UK in a few years' time. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to support reuse as well as recycling, because if you're going to be getting consumers to be doing the hard part of taking their packaging to a collection point to return it, then it almost seems like a waste. If you have a glass bottle that could just be washed and reused, but it's going to be put into a machine where it will be smashed and then, sent off for recycling, that in terms of behavior change, if we're already encouraging people to return their packaging, then why don't we try and reuse it as well as just recycling it?
Jo, did you want to add anything to that, or
Not really. I mean, in Scotland, the deposit return scheme will land in Scotland before it lands in other areas of the UK. So we might get slightly ahead of the curve to understand that nudge in consumer behaviour. But everything that everyone said, I think any regulation has to be thought through, but it also shouldn't be slow enough that nothing happens, even if it launches and there is mistakes made, that you can then learn from it. The other aspect to it, I think, is these market conditions. It's not just around plastic tax or deposit return schemes. There's the wider ones in terms of net zero emissions, carbon tax, carbon accounting, all of this stuff is eventually coming down that really will help the process of reuse, just as ever with any sort of legislation and regulation for entrepreneurial businesses. It never moves quick enough.
And that brings me to my next question. I was wondering, obviously, what would you say, what's the scope of sustainability benefits from reusable packaging when it comes to the carbon footprint and also the use of material in comparison to single-use packaging? And also how can we avoid unintended consequences, such as maybe a higher carbon footprint through loss rates, transport, cleaning, and etc. Sort of, how do you see the role of reusable packaging in that area?
Well, I don't mind doing this first. So there is lots of different information out there. We have done many different LCAs to ensure the viability of the reuse models in terms of the different packaging materials that we use and the different sizes of that packaging. So at the moment, we're using aluminium, glass, and stainless steel in a variety of different sizes, depending on what's right for the product sizes. And we've had an independent Ricardo Engineering that have, created the different LCAs. That's also being validated at the moment, both academically in the UK, but also by one of the big four as well from an accountancy perspective. And the reason for that is a lot of the times when you as an organisation come out with certain data, what happens is generally the naysayers say, well, you would say that. So we've gone with all of the different types of validation, and we have the data that if, because ours is a leasing model. So rather than a company buying packaging or buying the reusable packaging, what they're doing is they're leasing the packaging from our organisation, and that stays within the circle. When you lease packaging, then obviously you shouldn't be responsible for all of the carbon emissions for making that packaging in the first place. And we already have the data that even with just one reuse, and obviously that increases with more than one reuse, a company would instantly reduce their emissions associated with packaging by between 30 and 70%. Now that is huge. So if we take a Unilever, for example, billions and billions of pieces of packaging across the globe, and they've already said that 48% of their emissions comes from their packaging. That is a huge number to be able to make that statement. So I think emissions is a huge part, but leasing, reusable packaging is the way to be able to share that weight and reap the benefits of it, particularly if you're a much larger organization.
Well, I'm happy to add to that a bit. I think that, from our perspective, first and foremost, the value of reusable systems is that they do allow us to do more with less, right? And shift to a system that inherently designs out waste compared to a single-use system. But as has already been brought up also several times on this panel, reuse systems need to be environmentally sound, right? That the devil is in the details. It really matters how you design that it works, the whole system works together, because of course the number of loops that are actually achieved is really critical, right? So we really think that it's important to take into account all the potential consequences, including the sourcing of those materials and the end of life, that kind of thing. At WWF, we're really focused on what we call our one planet perspective, which means that we shouldn't go after a solution that just trades one crisis for another, right? We can't trade one harm for another on our planet. So we really need to have credible assurance that the reusable packaging that we are going for is actually being reused, that there's a system in place that works. And that's also why we've been working so hard on this metrics piece that I mentioned before, because we do think that having a standard way to measure that is super important. And while I have the floor, I'll just mention about LCA, because LCA has been brought up, life cycle assessment has been brought up quite a bit as a way to measure this. And I just wanted to bring up that we always advocate that life cycle assessment be used as one piece of evidence in decision making, but not considered to be some kind of ultimate truth, which is kind of how it is treated often in this space. And the reason for that is that life cycle assessment doesn't actually capture the full impacts of single-use systems, right? It's not great at showing everything. No one tool can do everything. So for example, the impact of plastic pollution are just not modeled in LCA. So in effect, single-use plastic at this point effectively has like a advantage in life cycle assessment, which is the main way that people make decisions about these kinds of things. So it really is important, I think, to keep that in mind.
I might just quickly add that I think, for brands and retailers, I would just encourage you to be very skeptical of suppliers who center their sustainability benefits off of how many times their packaging can be used. We see this so often. It's like, hey, here's the benefit if, based on how many times this thing can be reused. But can is not relevant. It's how many times is it reused? And understanding how that curve plays out is ultimately the only thing that matters. So, we've seen this time and again where companies will say, our packaging can be used 1,000 times or 100 times or 200 times. But when you look at the return rate, even if it's 90 or 95%, that only translates to 15 to 20 reuses. It's not relevant if it's made to be used 100 times, if the return rate means that it's lost so often in the use cycle that it never comes back. So the actual reuse is what drives actual environmental, not lab conditions, and just be very sensitive to that.
Yeah, completely agree with Mike's comments and the importance of the return rate and how behavior change therefore plays such a big part in the sort of sustainability of reuse systems. And another comment on sort of the durability of the packaging and if it can be used for 1,000 uses, realistically, is it ever going to be used for 1,000 uses? After that many uses, will a cup or a piece of packaging be so scratched or unattractive that a person wouldn't want to use it anymore? So finding the right balance between sort of the expected number of uses and the return rate, and perhaps, reducing material use so that your packaging lasts as long as realistically it needs to, and how often you think you're going to get it back and how often it's going to be used. And just another comment in terms of avoiding unintended consequences with the environmental impact of reuse systems. I think there's massive developments to be made in reverse logistics systems. So I spoke about collaboration earlier in terms of sort of more the consumer facing side of things, but also there's big opportunities to create more collaborative networks for reverse logistics, and also developing those in terms of technology, their efficiency, automation, resource use, so they use less water, and things like using electric vehicles in all the collections as well is going to help reduce the environmental impact.
Great, thank you, Rosie, and everybody. I was sort of coming back to points that a lot of you made already earlier in the discussion here at Packaging Europe. Obviously, we hear a lot about reusable or refillable packaging trials, often with big brands, and they get a lot of publicity, but then not many have really hit the mainstream, or they just sort of quietly disappear again and aren't really talked about anymore. Why do you think that is, and what can be done to sort of break that cycle, so to speak?
Again, I don't mind going first because a lot of that sits in with what we do. At the end of the day, the truth is that the world runs in a linear economy and makes money through a linear economy, and the circular economy is not the linear economy. So, when you're looking through a lens of only profit, and for much larger businesses, that generally is short-term profit, then your lens is very small. When you're looking through a circular approach, you're looking at systemic change and infrastructure change and a longer term approach. And the profit numbers will be very different to look at that. And I think that's really, having the status quo is much safer and easier for people that work in large businesses to say, well, I think we're okay just doing something that's a little less bad. So if we do something that produces a piece of packaging that is now fully recyclable, well, that's better, really. And it doesn't go to having to make what may seem like a leap The challenge that we have as a reuse provider and systems developer is demonstrating to those organizations that it's not a leap, that there is these smaller steps of change that are very profitable, and talk to those organizations in very, very linear terms rather than circular terms.
I mean, I guess I would say, and this might not given the sort of statements I've already made on this panel, to me, I think that it's easy to blame the big brands. I think that they have group and line operators who have been given very explicit directives from the C-suite that by 2025 or sometimes 2030, they're going to be 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable. And their teams have no idea how to operationalize that. So they come to companies like ours and Joe and others and say, help me. And they go out and learn, and they do pilots, which is what big brands have to do to learn and scale. But they don't have budgets because they're for profits. These things have to be competitive, and they don't have to be the same or cheaper necessarily, but they got to be close. And I think what we've seen is that a lot of the first wave of reuse initiatives have not come anywhere close to being economically competitive. And if you're a for-profit business, you're there to make money. So like, I tend to be more empathetic to the large retailers because I think that what the industry, like the sustainability and circularity industry, has brought to them has not really been built off of a scalable model. So we've sold them a lot of reuse fairy tales, to be honest, and they've found that they don't work because consumers aren't ready. And when you just make it this opt-in kind of approach, what you see is a lot of people will opt in once and not stick with it because it doesn't meet what they want. So that's where the government part really comes in. I think it has to be more than for-profit enterprises to lead the charge here. We've sort of put too much of it on industry to solve, as has been shared by, maybe the whole panel. I think that this is where the government part really is critical. But I'm very empathetic to the big businesses. I think we have to do a better job of making it simple and cost effective for them to then expect them to scale it out.
So I agree with Mike on the challenges. I maybe still am holding the brands a little bit more accountable for taking more action as well. But I do think, if you think about, a lot of people, a lot of companies have goals around, the packaging being recyclable, compostable, or reusable, right? Well, which one of those is the hardest to achieve, right? Which one takes the most systems change, right? It's reuse. It just costs a lot more. It takes a lot more investment to change over to that than to the other two. But arguably there could be much bigger rewards, right? To do so. So I do really strongly think that we need better policy incentives, and we also need a level playing field, right? Right now, the real cost of single use is very much an externality. So it does put reuse as a disadvantage. So I think we do really need policy incentives, and I think that we also need companies to step up and really think about how can they go past pilot scale, knowing that this is the direction that we need to move in the future.
I think there's some opportunities as well to sort of try and identify those easy wins where you can perhaps prove the business case a bit easier. So I already talked about models where you might already have logistics to deliver and collect from home, or also in the grocery sector, things like own brand supermarket products. Often one supplier is supplying multiple supermarkets with those products. So if you can engage the supplier there, then that is going to have a massive impact at scale. And a lot of own brand products will have less, less important design and branding characteristics. They're often more basic, more standardized. Milk bottles, water bottles, for example. Milk bottles are pretty much, they look the same across the board, no matter what supermarket you can go into. So if you can identify those sort of areas for an easy win at scale, and then hopefully sort of prove that it can work in some areas and build up from there.
Great, thanks very much, everybody. So, yeah, I have one last question for everybody, really quickly, because we've been so busy talking, the time's passed really quickly. What do you say from your different perspectives? What does the future of reusable packaging look like?
Oh, I'll jump in again. Sorry. Yeah. We talked about being polite, but anyway, so for me, if we do this panel again in 2 years' time or 3 years' time even, yeah, what I want to be coming in is that there's so much comments of saying, why did it take us so long to have all of these really easy consumables to be in reusable packaging? That for me is the dream, because it needs to happen.
I think for me, thinking perhaps not with the most realistic head on, but more of a, that my dream for the future, it would be building on this idea of having curbside collections and maybe rethinking the entire role of waste management, where instead of waste collectors collecting recycling and rubbish, and that's a one-way system, that they're more couriers of resources and they collect reusables. A MRF of the future is turned into a giant dishwasher where reusable packaging can be washed and then sent back to all the different suppliers and producers to be refilled. I think that would be my dream scenario.
Sure, I can jump in. I love both of those visions. We really envision that in the future, reuse will replace 20 to 30% of the single-use plastics that we rely on today, and that it will, will have these environmentally sound, economically sustainable, and socially inclusive systems in place that serve the needs of communities and also really play a key role to prevent plastic pollution.
And I guess I would just add that, we think about the profound change that's happening in how we deliver and consume goods today. The whole last mile challenge that exists globally at this point is both enabling and enabled by reuse, we think. And how that all plays out, I don't know. Billions of dollars were just thrown at 15-minute grocery delivery, only to see that model shockingly to nobody I would have assumed not work. Not a surprise to me, but there'll still be all this money thrown at new ways of getting stuff. And I think reuse is going to be a part of that evolution in a way that's going to be really exciting to see. So we're looking forward to that.
Great, thank you very much. Maybe just have a quick look at a couple of audience questions before we wrap up, but obviously feel free to continue the discussion on LinkedIn. All the questions will still be there, obviously, after the session. We had a question from somebody about LCAs, and they're wondering what's your viewpoint on the sometimes conflicting LCA insights for creating reusable packaging?
Just to jump in on that one, I think maybe that's something that we didn't mention in regulation as well, that creating standards for LCAs would really help in terms of making them easier to compare and contrast, and just setting parameters on how far back do you go, similar to what Alex was talking about. I think that would really help.
Yeah, I can add that, I think it's important to understand that LCAs are inherently subjective, right? I think a lot of times they're really treated as some kind of thing that is ultimately true once you get those results, right? But the choices you make, where you set your system boundaries, how you decide allocation, it all really, really matters. And having kind of standard ways to deal with reusables, and I think also a standard way to compare it to a single-use system is going to be really helpful and important. I don't have anything else profound to say about that, but I just think that in general, this is my personal soapbox, so sorry, that we rely too much on LCA for decision making in this space, and we need to think about other tools in the toolbox as well.
Great, thank you. And another question we had, how can we meet consumer expectations with reusable packaging when it will be subjected to scuffing and damage as the packaging is washed, refilled, and redistributed.
You go, Rosie.
Just going to say that I think that's something that will come with scale, normalization, making things more mainstream, and just getting people to maybe sort of reframe reusables. You know, if you go sit down in a restaurant or a pub, how often are you examining the scratches on your pint glass, or, you know, polishing your cutlery? And I think it's just, at the moment, it's something that sort of people are concerned about before they've even used it. But the more you use it, I think the more that will become less of a factor.
I agree. For us, we see it as a marketing opportunity. It's like every piece of packaging tells a story. You know, if you've got a body wash that's in a reusable packaging, and you know that one of the L'Oreal, you know, beauty ambassadors has also used that piece of packaging, you know, there's a great marketing opportunity, I think, particularly now that we're in the digital age. And believe it or not, with the trials that we've done so far, there's really limited, you know, the materials that we're using, you know, the actual scuffing and all of that kind of stuff, it's actually a lot lower than people maybe imagine.
Yeah, I would say from the secondary packaging standpoint, when we first started out, everyone's like, oh, these things got to be cleaned every time. They got to look pristine. And then everyone sort of realized, oh, this is delivery packaging. It's shown up to your door looking like it's been through the post. So it's not that important. And now we don't waste time or resources on that for most clients because they found their customers don't expect it, need it, require it. It's better. So I think I agree with the panelists. I think everyone's kind of getting used to it. They've sort of settled in, and that's for the better.
Great, thank you, everybody. So yeah, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But obviously, feel free to continue the discussion on LinkedIn. And yeah, thank you everybody for joining this session. And just a reminder that this panel discussion is part of our Sustainable Packaging Summit regular series of virtual events. And look out for more discussion panels in the coming months. And for more details on that and access, sign up on the Packaging Europe website. And of course, in September, we have our face-to-face Sustainable Packaging Summit. This will take place on the 13th and 14th of September in Lisbon. So it's a summit, not a conference, which means it brings together thought leaders to frankly and constructively discuss our sustainability challenges and how we can align around better strategies. And yeah, for that, again, register on the packaging or find more details on the Packaging Europe website. So yeah, that just leaves me to thank you for joining us, and also obviously thanks very much to our four speakers: Alex Grabowski, Mike Newman, and Joanne Chidley, and Rosie Sharp. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.